Hello all, welcome to Top 10 Literary Myths. This one's just for fun. All assertions here are only my opinion, and all of those opinions are correct. These myths are presented in no particular order of importance, so why call it a top 10 list at all? Who knows? Let's start with a popular one. Myth number 10. Shakespeare's work wasn't written by Shakespeare. This is the idea that the man who we know was born in Stratford and whose name is on the published work and whom all sorts of people at the time identified as a playwright was not in fact the author of the famous plays and poetry. People who believe this, the so-called anti-Stratfordians, take heart in the fact that lots of smart people have agreed with them. The primary reason these people are suspicious of poor old Bill is that they can't imagine these works of genius coming from anybody but an aristocrat. This guy's father was a glove maker, for God's sake. Although his dad was also the highest elected official in Stratford and presided at the Court of Record, among other positions. But how could this middle-class guy have written these sublime works? Surely only a nobleman could have the sensitivity and universal knowledge that animate those sacred pages. So despite the documentary chatter about Shakespeare as a playwright that managed to survive for 400 years, there must have been a conspiracy in place throughout London to falsely ascribe the plays and sonnets to this guy in order to protect the privacy of the real author. This is Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford and the current favorite candidate among the anti-Stratfordians for being the true bard. Well, to put it plainly, this belief comes from a cartoonish understanding of 16th century English society. Yes, these anti-strats are immersed in Shakespearean verse, and yes, Freud, Twain, and the rest were geniuses themselves, and the modern-day anti-strats are fine people. Still, these conspiracy theories don't seem to grasp the historical and social realities that gave rise to these works. One of those realities is the grammar school education that Shakespeare would have received, and which the anti-strats assumed to be negligible. But this education, which included Latin and Greek, was in fact more rigorous than that undertaken by many noblemen. More importantly, the anti-strats have no answer for the simple existence of Shakespeare's most famous fellow playwrights, Ben Jonson and Christopher Marlowe. Jonson's plays show greater classical learning than we see in Shakespeare's work, and yet both Jonson and Marlowe emerged from the same middle-class background that nurtured Shakespeare. If there must be a conspiracy behind Shakespeare's achievement because of his education, then there would have to be conspiracies behind Jonson's and Marlowe's as well. The fact is that anybody in London society had access to all of the books that inspired and taught Shakespeare. And as my brilliant wife will tell you, hey baby, Shakespeare was inspired by folk tales and traditions almost as much as by literary ones. But, say the anti-Stratfordians, Shakespeare's plays show a deep and esoteric knowledge of life at court and of life abroad that no city-bound actor could ever achieve. Look, I love Shakespeare. I'm a Shakespeare guy. I've watched Kenneth Branagh's 4-hour Hamlet no fewer than 9 times, and please don't tell me that version sucks. It does not suck. You suck. But the idea that these plays show any sort of specialized or esoteric knowledge is silly. But how could this untraveled man have the profound knowledge of Italy, say, that is shown in The Merchant of Venice? Well, the answer is that there is no profound knowledge of Italy in that play, or in any of the others. What one finds there are precisely the commonplaces about Italy that one would find in a London bookshop travelogue. The same is true of the English court. Nothing in the plays demonstrates any knowledge about that realm that was not readily available to any literate Londoner. Shakespeare didn't show us specialized or insider knowledge about the world. What the plays exhibit is rather an uncanny understanding of human character and relationships, no matter their role, region, or rank. Instead of slogging through the relevant historical evidence which has been done many times elsewhere, I will only point out the central methodological error behind the anti-Stratfordians' reconstruction of history, an error they share with most conspiracy theorists. As everybody knows, any historical narrative has to be pieced together by the scraps of documentary evidence that have survived. It might be convenient to think of that narrative as a tapestry. But in the 400-year-old case of Shakespeare's life and of London's theatre scene, which did not have any real standing as an institution and was not greatly inscribed into public record, that tapestry naturally has more holes than it does fabric. This is the case when you look at any non-nobleman of that period, no matter how popular their activities might have been to the London populace. The lives of ordinary people, including artists and poets, were simply not documented the way we are today. See my video on Foucault. In any historical determination, you're going to have positive evidence that supports it, and you're going to have problems, such as the lack of documentation that you might expect to be able to find, as well as inconsistencies and contradictions within the evidence you do have. The anti-Stratfordian method of analysis is to consider first the problems with the accepted historical determination, and then compare these with the positive evidence that exists for an alternative narrative. And indeed, there are historical facts that support the idea that Edward de Vere could have written those works. When you use that method of analysis, the case for de Vere looks good. You've got all these problems with the accepted official narrative, whereas you have positive reasons to believe the alternative. But that is precisely the method of analysis that good historians do not use. When you're weighing competing narratives, you have to compare the positive evidence for the one scenario with the positive evidence for the other, and then compare the problems with the one narrative with the problems that exist for the other. You have to compare like with like. You can't just avoid that to strengthen your case. And when you compare like with like evidence, the de Vere narrative stands no chance against the accepted Stratfordian one. The amount of positive documentary evidence we have that links Shakespeare with the plays and poetry is overwhelming compared to the positive evidence we have that de Vere had anything to do with them. And conversely, the number of inconsistencies in the historical record that trouble the case against Shakespeare is very small compared to the vast number of implausibilities and inconsistencies that undermine de Vere's case. If the gaps in the Shakespeare narrative look like this, then the gaps and lack of evidence for the de Vere narrative look like this. Comparing like with like evidence, the case for the Stratford guy posterizes the one for de Vere. Keep this in mind the next time you listen to a conspiracy theory. With the 9/11 truthers, for instance, ask them, if you take the positive evidence we have that the plot originated with the mostly Saudi Arabian agents of Al-Qaeda and compare it to the positive evidence we have that it originated with the Bush administration, which pile of evidence is higher? And if you compare the problems in the official story, and of course there are inconsistencies there, and compare them to the avalanche of problems and inconsistencies in the truther story, which is greater? Comparing like with like evidence can clear up all kinds of muddy thinking. Consider, for instance, the assertion of people like Sam Harris that the doctrines of Islam cause violence because many terrorists are Muslim and cite their religion as the justification for their acts. According to Harris, we can discern whether a religious doctrine causes violence by looking at the actions performed by those adherents and listening to whether they claim that killing infidels is justified. To Harris, this premise proves the violence inherent in Islam. But that's only because he's not following his own premise. His premise requires that we look at the actions and claims of Muslim adherents, not simply the actions and claims of Islamic terrorists. Given that the overwhelming majority of ordinary hardworking Muslims around the world are not violent and explicitly reject the idea that their religion justifies the murder of infidels, Harris's premise means that he's losing his own argument by a factor of roughly 1.8 billion to 1.
Well, first let me say that
Myth number 9. The Great Gatsby is one of the greatest novels ever written. No, it's not. It is an insipid tragedy that tells us great men build empires for the love of women who ultimately prove to be nothing more than self-absorbed ingrates. Sure, there are other things going on in the novel, but it's really just a bowl of nothing, like that side salad you get at Cracker Barrel. Moving on.
Number 8. Number 8. Number 8. Number 8.
Myth number 8. Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe demonstrates in fiction that European man does not need civilization to survive. Sorry, I can't figure out how to shorten that. It's been a truism for centuries now that this is a tale of a shipwrecked man facing death on a remote island without the trappings of civilization, and yet his grit and ingenuity alone pulls him through. For this truism to be true, however, you have to edit out of your consciousness the fact that this castaway has in his possession a very special object. More than any other object I can think of, it's one that is uniquely imbued with the collective power of 18th century industrial civilization.
What is it?
His gun. Duh. How on earth could anyone ever have asserted that Crusoe represents a naked mankind facing the perils of nature when he has the one object that can grant safety from predators and food for his tree trunk table? It is easy to forget the gun and what it really represents. Its compact and sleek opacity hides the fact that it's the product of centuries of concentrated research, craftsmanship, and metal refinery, all of which are impossible without the industrial power of a massive society. By no means could an individual ever invent and produce such a thing. This musket is the product not just of industry, but of centuries of bureaucratic, mercantile, and political apparatus. There are few machines whose evolution and refinement relied so heavily on a global marketplace, on reciprocal innovations that took place step by step across many nations and many lifetimes. There is no other artifact into which global civil society is as densely compacted, and there is no object to whose operation and perfection humanity is more deeply committed. So Robinson Crusoe is doing pretty much the opposite of surviving nature without the trappings of civilization. Whatever Daniel Defoe's intentions may have been, this is not a story about the innate aptitude of the individual. When you shoot a gun, it is so satisfying to believe that the power you're wielding is not the product of a vast collective global industry, but rather that this power belongs to the awesome individual pulling the trigger.
Número 7.
Myth number 7. In Henry James's story, The Turn of the Screw, we can never really know whether the children were communicating with ghosts or if the narrator is just delusional. Oh Lord, are you kidding? The most ambiguous ghost story in the English language? No, look, there is no ambiguity about the ghosts, and there is no question that the governess is projecting them from her own repressed consciousness. The first time the governess supposedly sees a ghost, she does so just as she's fantasizing about her new employer. The first narrator in the story tells us that this man was a scrumptious bachelor in the prime of life. He was, quote, handsome and bold and pleasant, and he, quote, struck the governess as gallant and splendid, such a figure as had never risen save in a dream or an old novel before a fluttered, anxious girl out of a Hampshire vicarage, end quote. The young woman is raised in a vicarage, no less, the very home address of sexual repression. So here she is walking the grounds for the first time, and as she turns a corner, she fantasizes about suddenly meeting his, quote, handsome face, which would, quote, stand before me and smile and approve, just as she had hoped in the preceding paragraph that her service was, quote, giving pleasure to her employer. And so when she turns the corner, suddenly, he did stand there, quote unquote. The expected handsome figure is standing on a tower attached to the main house. But wait, it can't be him, she realizes, because he's not on the property. And the figure turns, walks out of sight, and here we have the first ghost, the first apparition, as she puts it, that she encounters in the story. I really don't know what more James could have done to basically scream in our ear, this apparition is a projection of the governess, the redirection of her repressed erotic desire for her dreamy employer. And if you read closely all of the subsequent apparitions in the story, they're always accompanied by the erotic anxieties and yearnings of the governess. Ghosts by themselves are meaningless. They only have meaning as they represent something else, usually something from the past, or in the case of the governess, her hidden desires that somebody is ignoring or repressing. This is true even in stories where the ghosts are real, quote unquote. This is why even the dumb versions of those stories trace the ghosts back to some, quote, Indian burial ground or something, to suggest that the horror visited upon the modern world is a punishment for the crimes of our collective past. That's kind of true in The Shining, for instance, but Jack's possession in that movie is really just an extension of the latent anger he's come to feel about his entire life, but which he's never admitted to himself.
Boy, we must really be high up. The air feels so different.
It's the return of the repressed. Without that, a ghost fiction is just a pointless game of Five Nights at Freddy's. So, for The Turn of the Screw, we have two choices. It's either about a woman whose erotic repression is so profound that she begins to see a conspiracy emerging between the children in her care and some projected ghosts that she thinks are corrupting them with precisely the kind of forbidden knowledge that she herself is freaking out about. It's either that, or the ghosts really are there, and the story is about an ordinary woman and some kids, and then some ghosts decide to show up for no particular reason. Yeah, that would be a pile of great literature right there. Myth number 6. George Orwell's 1984 is a well-written novel. Okay, step 1. Go read George Orwell's 1984. Step 2, say out loud, this is really well written. Step 3, go straight to hell. Myth number 5, maybe Hamlet really was crazy, kinda. No, and not just because Hamlet explicitly says he's gonna pretend to be mad so that he can probe and prod the new king without letting him know he's aware of the man's murderous deed.
Sir, I cannot.
What, my lord?
Make you a wholesome answer. My wit's diseased.
The play is making a point about responsibility here, not madness. The play is not about the cowardice of a prince who can't bring himself to kill his murderous uncle, but it is about the cowardice of youth when it wants to throw darts at authority without having to take responsibility for being the dart thrower. Hamlet hides behind his so-called madness so that he can spit snide remarks at the king in public. And then when Claudius takes him to task for his insults and insinuations, Hamlet's supposed madness lets him disclaim all responsibility.
I have nothing with this answer, Hamlet. These words are not mine.
No, not mine now.
Contrast this behavior with that of the other son in the play, whose father Hamlet irresponsibly slaughters. Laertes, unlike Hamlet, instantly marches up to the king, who he thinks is the culprit, and accuses him to his face, unafraid of the consequences. The scholar Charlotte Artese reminds me that the play at least invites us to wonder about Hamlet's sanity, since the condition of madness is so clearly underscored in the case of Ophelia. Ophelia's brain seems to break when she learns that her father has been killed by her lover, a man whom her father had forced her to reject because he might be a faithless philanderer. But this madness too allows Ophelia to say things in public that she never could otherwise. As with Hamlet, some of Ophelia's mad talk is an allusion to the licentiousness of the king and queen. And her continual references to maids losing their virginity is either a confession about Hamlet or an angry cry about his base intentions toward her, hidden under the guise of true love, which to her would seem to be confirmed by his abusive sex talk after their breakup.
Lady, shall I lie in your lap?
No, my lord.
I mean my head upon your lap.
Aye, my lord.
What do you think I meant country matters?
Just as a ghost by itself is meaningless, so too is the idea of pure madness. And hey, did somebody say Hamlet? Are you sick of Hamlet yet? Too bad. Myth number 4. Hamlet's tragic flaw is indecision or hesitation. Everyone knows that. But consider, the idea that Hamlet should be steadfast in revenging his father's death is only what the ghost of that father wants him to think. And Hamlet's father is an a-hole whom nobody should be listening to. In a correct reading of the play, and I did promise nothing but correct readings here, what Hamlet is fatally ignoring is not revenge against the murderer Claudius. It is the threat of young Fortinbras, who is coming to take revenge for the death of his father, who was killed by none other than the aforementioned a-hole. There's a good reason this drama is usually misread, because virtually every production that has ever been mounted of this play cuts out the Fortinbras storyline. Of course, you do have to cut lots of things out of the play script, otherwise you have a 4-hour production. But because virtually all stage directors are under the spell of King Hamlet's ghost, they do exactly what the ghost wants everybody to do: to erase from our memory the sins of the father. So why am I impugning Daddy Hamlet? After all, in Horatio's account of the history, it was Fortinbras, the strong arm, who dared King Hamlet to the combat. But he also says the king was, quote, pricked on by a most emulate pride. And we know the cause of this fight was nothing noble, but rather a wager over land. It suggests a rapacious motive that fits entirely with the roving plunderer who was Shakespeare's model for King Hamlet's character, the Viking Horwendil. The play is based largely on a legendary history of Prince Hamlet compiled in the 12th century by Saxo Grammaticus. In that story, just before Hamlet's father slays the Norwegian king, that man insists that their enmity should not extend beyond this fight, that their hatred for each other should not be visited upon their kin after the combat. In other words, the duel should not create a revenge cycle. So, naturally, after the fight, the a-hole hunts down and kills the Norwegian king's sister, a warrior named Sela.
Dude!
Meanwhile, in Hamlet, Shakespeare begs us to question the propaganda that the Danes naturally spout about the heroism and goodness of the prince's father. As Horatio is recounting the combat, he says, quote, "Our valiant Hamlet, for so this side of our known world esteemed him, did slay this Fortinbras." Come on now, look at that. There is no way on earth that the poet, so careful and selective of his words, would bother to point out that the king is not necessarily considered valiant by those outside of rotten Denmark, unless he wanted the audience to question that valor as well. Ghosts, and here we are haunted by ghosts again, are portents. If they appear, that means something is wrong, out of joint. If only the ghost would speak, it would tell us what is wrong and what we should do. When the ghost first appears on stage, it remains silent. Prince Hamlet asks the ghost not only what his appearance means, but, quote, what should we do? But if this ghost really were here to point Hamlet in the right direction, he'd say, look, son, young Fortinbras is coming to take revenge for his dad, whom I killed. You'd better do something about that. He'll be here shortly to sack the kingdom, which is in fact true. Hey son, maybe you should work out some kind of reparation with Fortinbras for the sins of your father, me, and maybe avoid losing everything to Norway. Instead, the ghost gives the worst advice possible. Ignoring the external calamity that's rapidly approaching due to the revenge cycle that he created, the ghost instructs his son to kill Claudius and create a new and separate revenge cycle within Denmark. This fatal gaze inward precludes Hamlet from looking outside his realm.
Let the doors be locked! Treachery, sing it out!
And is reflected nicely in Kenneth Branagh's adaptation with this ring of mirrors around the palace, through which Fortinbras's dudes bust in and surprise everybody. So the problem is not that Hamlet hesitates to take revenge, it's that he is completely blind to the revenge that's coming for him. Myth number 3. Don Quixote is about a man whose charming and heroic idealism is tragically thwarted by the harsh realities of life.
To dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not go, to right the unrightable wrong, to love sure and chaste from afar. To try when your arms are too weary to reach the unreachable star.
What, are you kidding me?
There is nothing tragic or idealistic or heroic about the man from La Mancha. Cervantes makes clear he's a dangerous fool whose brain has been addled by what they used to call romances and tales of chivalry. The whole point of the book is to exhibit a new kind of historically grounded fiction that takes place in our world, not once upon a time in a land far, far away, but here and now, where the people described could be your neighbors. This is why Cervantes, unlike virtually any fiction writer of his time, frequently refers to contemporary Spanish society, the politics of his time, and even himself as a living individual. And that is why the book is plausibly described as the first European novel. Quixote's character represents what Cervantes sees as the irrelevance and foolishness of the old stories, the romances, and this novel's contempt for this character is obvious. Yet in our general imagination of this novel today, we tend to think with a smile of poor old Quixote as an unconquerable idealist in an otherwise harsh and cynical world. But I'm not sure that smile would linger if we would remember, say, how he assaulted a group of traveling monks because he preferred to imagine them as sorcerers. Myth number 2. The Ambassadors takes the American side in the Europe versus US grudge match known as Henry James' International Theme. This one is so obscure it's sure to annoy everyone, especially the 7 people who have remained watching this video. Please direct any complaints to the YouTube support team. In the novels of Henry James, the so-called international theme is not really international, given that it only ever seems to involve England, France, and the United States. Don't say Italy. For James, that country's just a quaint resort. James is always confronting the supposed optimism and cultural stupidity of America with the supposed cynicism and cultural refinement of Europe. Americans are open, honest, naive, and ignorant of world history, whereas Europeans are thoughtful, sly, sophisticated, and world-weary. In most of the work of his early and middle period, James tells a tale of some friendly and rich American getting involved with a sophisticated European who usually turns out to be taking advantage of the poor rich Yank. And that's the story most literary critics stick with when discussing James's major phase, as they say, his final 3 novels, each massive in every sense of the word. These books supposedly tell us that Americans might be stupid, but at least they're not evil. The reality is that, having lived in England for 30 years, James's sensibility gradually moseyed over to the European side. This shift is evident in the last 2 novels, but it's harder to make the case for the Golden Bowl, so I'll just stack the deck in my favor by talking about The Ambassadors, which is really the best thing he ever wrote anyway.
Can I go?
Yeah. See, what happened with James in these later years is that he got really, really sick of the American habit of self-exposure, and the idea that a truly honest and virtuous person has no secrets, nothing that they should keep private. What really annoyed James was that these tell-all yahoos expected everybody else to expose themselves as well. He hated that privacy and reserve had become a sign of dishonest evasion. So he writes The Ambassadors, the story of Lambert Strether, an intelligent middle-aged man whose literary review is financially dependent on his fiancée, Mrs. Newsom. This strong-willed widow sends Strether to Paris on a mission to retrieve her son Chad, who's been out there soaking up loose European morality for far too long. Thus Strether becomes an ambassador for Woollet. That is, the kind of Americans who socially dominate his Woollet, Massachusetts hometown. The only problem is that Strether is more open-minded and culturally curious than his American retainers. Strether suspects that his target, Chad, is attached to Paris because he wants to marry the beautiful young Jeanne. But then, to the horror of both Strether and the Woollet bunch, they catch wind of the possibility that Chad is actually the lover of Jeanne's mother, the radiant Madame de Vionnet. This lady is Paris incarnate, and it is she who has groomed Chad into a strikingly mature and sophisticated young man. So Strether, being an American but a mild one, gently demands the truth about these other people's relationships. Before confronting Chad himself, Strether asks one of Chad's friends whether his relationship with Madame de Villeneuve is a virtuous attachment. The diplomatic friend responds politely, "I can only tell you that it's what they pass for. But isn't that enough?" Strether naively takes this to be a yes to his question. He doesn't understand that he's now in a society that values privacy over other people's so-called right to know. It's a society that does not see anything dishonest or evil about the idea that you have a public face and a private one, and that you have an absolute right to maintain a difference between the two. The Woollett crew is just the latest in a long line of self-righteous Americans in James's fiction who insist that only a scoundrel refuses to make his private life available to the public. Characters like George Flack, Henrietta Stackpole, and the unnamed narrator of the Aspern Papers, just to name a few. So because Strether grows fond of Chad, who has become a very thoughtful and interesting young man, and has become so largely because of Madame de Villeneuve's influence, and because Strether becomes a great admirer of hers as well, he, Strether, eventually switches sides. He betrays his American mission to rescue Chad from the clutches of the evil French, and becomes their ambassador instead. He ends up being an advocate for Chad's freedom, for his desire to stay in Europe and eventually marry, Strether thinks, Madame de Villeneuve's lovely daughter. So of course it turns out in the end that Chad and Madame de Villeneuve are in fact lovers, and Strether feels a bit hurt and disillusioned. Nonetheless, Strether remains gracious to both Chad and Madame, and bravely accepts the consequences of his switching sides, which means being rejected by Mrs. Newsom and her whole Woollett clan, and having to live as an independent and somewhat lonely man. Critics of the novel almost universally praise Strether's stiff upper lip, and gently chastise him for his naivete. He should have known, they say, not to trust those French and their moral laxity. But these critics are dumb. James's point in this novel is that Strether is naive, yes, but naive to trust in his righteous certainty that other people's private lives must conform to the face they choose to present to the public, especially when those private arrangements are none of his damn business. Here at the end of James's writing career, almost, and having spent most of his life in England, he was now leaning more to the European side in his great two-world international theme.
Number one!
Did you know that number one is super easy to write? Pay attention.
Myth number 1. Interpretation is subjective.
It's also subjective anyway.
No, it isn't. Let's say you're interpreting a poem. The first thing you do is look at the actual words involved, which you did not invent. You look at the words, phrases, sentences, whatever, and consider what they evoke. That's not a mystical, subjective process. It's just the ordinary act of thinking about what a person who knows that language would associate with that bit of text. That person that you're thinking about, and this is the important part, is not just yourself. You're thinking about what a person who knows the relevant language, culture, and history would associate with that term. Let's say you're considering the word snow within a poem. Now, you personally might have some very specific association in your head with that word. It makes you think of gummy bears, say, because as a kid you were once trapped for hours in a blizzard on a highway, and those little bits of plastic were all you had to eat in the car. So you associate snow with gummy bears. But unless you have a very specific kind of cognitive disorder, you do not include gummy bears in your interpretation of the snow poem, because you know that that association is peculiar to yourself and is not part of the shared cultural linguistic network of association that makes the poem intelligible in the first place. In other words, when you interpret, you specifically reject any association that is merely subjective. Interpretation is necessarily an attempt to see how a statement might be meaningful within a shared language, history, and culture, none of which was invented or maintained by you alone, and certainly not by your subjectivity. Well, thank you all for joining me in this amazing adventure, etc. The end.